Okay, should we begin now that it's already recording? So hi everyone, good afternoon, Shabbat Tov, it's good to see you all. So many familiar faces. So welcome to Haskalah's continuing adult ed course, which focuses this year on Jewish history and culture. In the previous sessions, we looked at some of the earlier leaders of the American Jewish community, and focusing also on discussions around belonging to America as Jews, what the conflicts are, and how to be Jewish and American at the same time, how to adapt to the new American reality. Discussions around anti-Semitism and assimilation. So these are some of the topics we have covered so far. And today I'm gonna introduce you to one of my personal favorite rabbis of all time, Judah Magnes, who was an advocate for cultural pluralism in the US, and then later on in his about last 2 decades of his life, an advocate for cultural pluralism in mandatory Palestine. Without any further ado, let's begin. As always, you're invited to ask questions, make any comments. I'm not an all-knowing person. And if you know any fun facts about anything I say, feel free to share. Or if something is not clear, feel free to ask, unmute yourself, or use the chat box. The presentation will not be that long, but I will provide you a brief overview of Magnes's biography, and then we are also going to look at some of the articles and sermons that Magnes produced on the issue of cultural pluralism. All right, so let's begin. We begin with a picture of Judah Magnes, which is not his picture as a young boy, but more like an adult. So Judah Magnes was born in San Francisco to a family of German Jewish immigrants. He attended a Reform community in Oakland, outside of San Francisco, where he was a student of Ray Frank, and you can see Ray Frank on the right side of the slide. Ray Frank is a very interesting person on her own. She was the first Jewish woman to preach officially from a pulpit in the United States. She was not a rabbi, but she was working as a preacher and a teacher. And Judah Magnes grew up in the congregation where Ray Frank was fulfilling these rabbinic roles and educator roles, and was also an educator to Magnes. And apart from Ray Frank, there is another person whom I wanted to mention as an early influencer on Magnes's intellectual development, and that's Rabbi Meyer Solomon Levi, who was incorporating scientific findings into his teachings and sermons, and was also an early supporter of Zionism. And we are going to speak later in more detail about Zionism and what that meant for Judah Magnes, because very often when we use this word, there are of course different interpretations, and the way Magnes understood Zionism is pretty different from how the majority of us today understand Zionism. So that's something we're going to spend some time with later on. I also wanted to mention that Magnes was actually not born with the first name Judah. His parents, who were German Jewish immigrants, gave him the first name Julian, and Judah was a name that Magnes chose at a later point in his time, in his early 20s, which was also a sign for his return to a more traditional Jewish identity instead of a more assimilated Jewish identity that was expressed, according to him, by his first name, Julian. So that's all I have about his background. what's also interesting for us is his way of studies and education, how he became a rabbi eventually and a public intellectual. So he studied at the University of Cincinnati and at the Hebrew Union College, also in Cincinnati, Ohio. You can see that on the picture above. As you know, this is until today the major Reform rabbinical seminary, which has been around since the 1800s and has trained generations of Reform rabbis. The Hebrew Union College was especially popular among German American Jews or American Jews of German origin. And most of its teachers were also part of the German American Jewish community. So it kind of makes sense for Magnes, who, as I mentioned before, is also a kid, a descendant of German American immigrants, to go and attend rabbinical seminary at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. And following his ordination as a rabbi in 1900, he moved to Berlin, where he studied at the University of Berlin. It's a coincidence. Also, that's the university where I did my doctorate, and that's the building. That's the main building of our university. So that's where, I mean, that's actually not the building where Magnes studied, but that's like the main building of our university. And he got a doctoral degree in just under 3 years in philosophy. And he actually spoke German through his family's history with German culture. He knew German well enough to attend university in Germany. And it was here in Berlin that he first encountered Zionist activities and activism. As you might recall, and we're gonna go over this in just a few minutes, the reform movement of the time in the US was not Zionistic, because the reform movement of the time understood Judaism as a religion and not as ethnicity. And the argument was, if Jews are not an ethnicity, they don't need a nation state. The Jews, according to the reform movement of the late 1800s, were Americans by ethnicity and Jews by religion. And this approach was not only valid for Reformed Jews in the US, but also for Reformed Jews in Germany, for Reformed Jews in the UK, in France. So that was a pretty common approach towards citizenship and belonging in the 1800s among Reformed Jews. And it is for this reason that the Reformed Jewish movement as an institution was not Zionistic, and Magnes did not encounter Zionist teachings as a rabbinical student. And his Hebrew was very basic. He learned Hebrew among the Zionist student unions in Germany, especially in Berlin. And together with these student groups, he also got to travel around Eastern Europe mostly. So he visited regions which are today in Poland or Ukraine or Slovakia, Hungary, in Eastern Central Europe. And according to his biographers, the experiences he made in Eastern Europe eventually made him more traditional than most Reformed Jews were, and also made him feel more connected to Jews as a people in general. And it was also during these years that he made the decision to change his name from Julian, which is, as you know, non-Jewish German name, to Judah, which is, of course, in Hebrew. I wonder, has anyone ever been to Cincinnati? I've always wanted to visit the campus, because also it's historically so important.
I think the airport I've been to.
Okay, that's something. Maybe we can organize a tour with Haskalah to Cincinnati one time, because it's really one of the cradles of American Reform Judaism. So, and I know we are not a Reform community, but still, I think it's interesting. It's interesting. Okay, sorry for the intermezzo. So, after these years he spent in Germany, he altogether 3 years, as I mentioned, because he did his doctorate in 3 years. That's a very impressive amount of time. he returned to the US, and instead of the West Coast, he ended up staying in New York. So he settled in New York, got married in New York, and he became Temple Emmanuel's pulpit rabbi in 1906. I brought you 2 images of. Anyone wanna guess what the image on the top is? Oh, I just see that Robert lived in Cincinnati for 3 years. Good for you. Sounds good. And I like that you call Cincinnati Cincy.
It's easier than spelling it.
Right. So the picture, okay, anyway, the picture above is Temple Emmanuel in Manhattan. If you ever happen to be in Manhattan, I can recommend you to check out Temple Emmanuel. It's a very impressive building. Some might say it looks like a church, but it's not a church. It's a synagogue. It's one of the major Reform synagogues in the US. And it's a huge building and also impressive when it comes to architecture, both from the outside and inside. So this was Magnes's first pulpit. It didn't last too long though. So as I have already implied, during his time in Germany, Magnes became more traditional than an average Reform rabbi was at his time. So he had a lot of conflicts with the leadership of the synagogue and also with congregants, especially around questions of particularism versus universalism. What does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean to be American? How do we reconcile these 2 identities? I have already referred to the mainstream Reform position at the time, which was that Jews are not an ethnicity, Jews are not a people, but only a religious group within the American people. That was codified in the 1885 Pittsburgh Platform. And therefore, the Reform prayer books and statements and rabbinical sermons omitted references to Jewish peoplehood. They omitted references to the land of Israel because they omitted the whole idea of Jews having to return to Palestine. And instead, they were focusing on Americanness and encouraging the congregants to identify only as Americans when it comes to peoplehood and not as Jews. It was also for this reason that the Reform movement at the time abandoned the bar mitzvah services because they considered it to be too old-fashioned and un-American. So instead, they instituted what? What did the Reform movement come up with in the 1800s instead of the B'nai Mitzvah services?
Confirmation.
That's absolutely Joy. So if you ever meet someone who had confirmation, they probably went to a Reform synagogue, not exclusively, but confirmation was an idea of the 1800s to replace the bar mitzvah services, because bar mitzvah was too foreign, was too oriental or whatever. And instead they came up with confirmation, which of course is more compatible, at least that's how they viewed it, with the Protestant norms of America of the 1800s. So instead of bar mitzvah services, Temple Emmanuel and also other Reform shuls of the time had confirmations. They also abandoned Hebrew, so services were not in Hebrew, but almost exclusively in English. I have to note that all these developments were not exclusively true for the American Reform movement. You can find similar developments also in European Reform synagogues or congregations of the time. But as you can imagine, Magnes was not entirely comfortable in this environment, and he tried to achieve some changes. He tried to bring back Hebrew. That was definitely one of his campaigns. He tried to bring back the bar mitzvah services. He tried to bring back references to the land of Israel and to Jewish peoplehood in the Siddurim, in the prayer books, but he did not succeed. He was labeled as a dreamer of the ghetto by some members of the board at Temple Emmanuel. And eventually, 4 years later, 4 years after he ascended to the pulpit, he resigned and left Temple Emmanuel behind. Now, even though he was ordained as a Reform rabbi, and as I just presented, his first 4 years as a pulpit rabbi were in a Reform congregation, he then chose to continue his rabbinic work at a conservative shul at Bnei Jeshurun, which you can see again on the right side. Bnei Jeshurun is until today a major conservative synagogue, also in Manhattan, and also very interesting from a perspective of architecture. So I recommend you to visit it if you are in New York and have the opportunity to visit these two synagogues. Both of them are worth a visit. So here in Bnei Jeshurun, Magnes ended up working only for 2 years. That was not successful either. Here he had a different problem. Here the issue was not the traditionalism, but Magnes's problem was that the community, as Magnes said, was like a church. And even though they had Hebrew, even though they had Bar Mitzvah services, even though they kept the references to the land of Israel, etc., it was still too official, and it was not community-like. There was no community there. That's something that Magnes missed in Bnei Jeshurun, and because he kind of imagined the synagogue to be a community center at the same time. In this sense, we can compare him to Mordecai Kaplan, Reconstructionist philosopher, whatever, who advocated for the establishment of Jewish community centers. Now, Magnes did have a similar approach about 10 years before Mordecai Kaplan came up with this idea. And that's something that he missed in Bnei Jeshurun, according to the records. He felt that it was just a house of prayer and not a house of community. And I think that's also something that can make us think about what our synagogues are like. Are they only house of prayer or also house of community? I think that we at Haskalah are doing pretty good, but there is always room for improvement to be more than just a house of prayer, but also become a house of community and also, of course, a house of study. And we are today definitely a house of study, even if only on Zoom. It's a virtual house of study. So I think we are good. So, and there is something else which Magnes kept very occupied, and that was the idea of the melting pot. Now, before we are going to read now an article, a sermon by Magnes, or at least parts of a sermon, but about the melting pot. But before we would do that, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what the melting pot idea was and how that relates to Judah Magnes. So those of you who have attended classes with me before have heard this already, because we had classes on the same age and the same geographic location before, and I gave you the same historical background. So, but it never hurts to repeat. Repetition is the mother of knowledge, or however they say that. So as you know, at the end of the 1800s, till Congress passed laws restricting Jewish immigration in 1921 and 1924, about 2 million Jews came to the US, mostly from Eastern Europe. I assume that some of you today have ancestors who came to the US at this time from the Pale settlements, from present-day Ukraine, from present-day Belarus, from present-day Poland. Many of them were fleeing pogroms, escaping economic difficulties or military service, and they stayed in the US. So the overwhelming majority of these Jewish immigrants who arrived in America in the late 1800s stayed here, which is unique because, of course, very often when people migrate, they return to their country of origin, but Jews did not do that. So the overwhelming majority of them stayed in the US. And having suddenly 2 million immigrants, Jewish immigrants in the US, led to some discussions about their belonging and what they will do in America and how they will become American, or how will their process of becoming American look like. And at the time, especially in the very early 1900s, especially in the 1910s, the term melting pot became very popular, and it was endorsed by the political and cultural elite of the United States. And they imagined that if every civilization, every culture, every religion will be melted together, then that will be an ideal situation. And Jews were also expected to melt and to be part of this melting pot. However, there were some problems with the melting pot, namely that the dominant culture, which is the Anglo-Protestant culture in the case of the United States, remained dominant even after the melting. No matter how hard people melted, Anglo-Protestants did remain in the leading positions in politics and culture, and resentments at the same time against non-Anglo, non-Protestant communities continued. They did not cease to exist. And these resentments affected Jews, of course, but not only Jews, also Catholics. I think that we have to keep in mind that at the end of the 1800s, anti-Catholic sentiments in the US were huge and present not only on the streets. There were pogroms against Catholics in several states across the country, but also in politics, and all these sentiments affected, of course, also other religious minorities and ethnic minorities. But nevertheless, there were also advocates, people advocating for the melting pot, and also in the Jewish community. And in 1809, a play by the playwright Israel Zangwill was published. It was a very popular play called The Melting Pot, about a Russian Jewish immigrant coming to the US and then marrying a non-Jewish woman and then becoming American and leaving his Judaism behind. And that's the story in a nutshell. I hope I didn't spoil it for anyone. And there is like a major speech by this immigrant figure in the play, where he kind of expresses what the melting pot is or should be. Would anyone like to read that for us? You can see it on the slide on the left side. So we are about to read a sermon by Magnes, and his sermon is basically a reaction to this melting pot play. That's why I would also like us to read something from the play. Liz, please.
America is God's crucible, the great melting pot where all the races of Europe are melting and reforming. Here you stand, good folk, think I, when I see them at Ellis Island. Here you stand in your 50 groups with your 50 languages and histories, and your 50 blood hatreds and rivalries. But you won't be long like that, brothers, for these are the feuds and vendettas. Germans and Frenchmen, Irishmen and Englishmen, Jews and Russians, into the crucible with you all. God is making the American.
Thank you, Liz. I wonder, do you want to reflect on that? Anyone?
It's like you said, it no matter how much was added to the melting pot, it's the same things kind of rose to the top. You know, we never changed the taste of the soup that much, you know?
Right. That's a good way of putting it.
I question why the character made it religious. And why is God making the American?
Wow, that's a good point.
And isn't this character the one who came from Russia and was Jewish?
Yes, that's correct.
So if he's moved past his Jewishness at the point that he's talking, why still put it all on God?
So that's a very good question. I would think that it's connected to like a civil religion, that even people who don't identify as religious or who are not members of any church will refer to God. And like if you check what's on the banknote, it says in God we trust, right? I think it says in God we trust.
Yeah, still does.
Yeah, here. It says in God we trust. So, you know, the US is theoretically a secular country, but a language around God and a divine protection and whatever, good and evil, all these biblical and religious, they are very present, I think.
Like manifest destiny, you know.
Exactly. Yep. Yep. So I would think that the reference to God here is part of an American civil religion. I don't know, because I'm not Israel Sanguil, and I'm not sure why he used that term, but that's how I read it. That's how I read it. Yeah, unless there are any remarks or questions, we can go on and read what Magnes had to say about the melting pot. And that's by the way, Israel Sanguil on the right. He was not even American, by the way. He was British. He was British, but he wrote for an American audience, and he believed in the American melting pot model. And his plays were very popular, and I know that American presidents attended his plays, so he was a big deal. Okay, so I mean, I have already mentioned, I already made references to anti-Semitism and, you know, sentiments against ethnic religious minorities. So, which is to me the obvious proof for the melting pot not functioning and not working as it's promised. So let's take a look at now Magnes and what Magnes had to say about the melting pot model. This is a sermon which he gave in 1909. He was still a rabbi at Temple Emmanuel at the Reform Temple in Manhattan. And these are some quotes I selected arbitrarily from his sermon. The sermon was entitled The Republic of Nationalities, and that was his alternative model to the melting pot model. Would anyone like to read these selected quotes from The Republic of Nationalities?
I got it.
Oh, thanks.
Some would demand of a prospective American that in order to become completely an American, he abandon his traditional religion, his national language, his race, his culture, his history, his traditions, his customs, his ideals. It is such things that a man is asked by some to give up in the name of Americanization. You want me to keep going? We must, all of us, accommodate ourselves to our surroundings. Everyone must learn the language of the land. Everyone must seek to understand the spirit of its history, its laws, its institutions, its ideals. But this accommodation should not mean that a man's traditional natural culture must be abandoned. Jews should cling with reverence to the national culture of the fathers. This process is desirable both from the point of view of the individual and for the sake of the developing culture of this country.
Thank you, Joy. I wonder, do you agree with these statements about being American and being Jewish, being an immigrant and being a citizen, all these contradictions? What do you think when you read or hear these sentences? And imagine this was a sermon. So this is a sermon he delivered from a pulpit.
Well, the fourth one down, Jews should cling with reverence. That makes me think simply of how many ethnic pride days we mark in the United States. And so many of them, like we have St. Patrick's Day has become about Irish, and plenty of non-Irish people are welcome to take part.
Yeah.
So why should Jews be any different? Although, of course, that's looking at, I'm not sure when any ethnic pride things became formalized and or accepted.
I wonder when that started. Like what time frame? Yeah.
So, Joy, bringing up the Irish example, I think that's perfect, because Irish national culture in the US develops around at the same time as Jewish national culture develops. So that's absolutely, I think that's a very good example.
It reminds me once somebody had said, instead of a melting pot, we're more of a quilt, where you have all these pieces that come together, and it might be a mess in the back, but together the whole thing as a whole is beautiful and colorful and made up of all the little bits. So yeah.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is basically the same as what Magnes is saying. You're using different words. He says a republic of nationalities, you said a quilt.
Yeah.
But in the end effect, it sounds pretty similar.
Yeah.
I know in Canada they don't use the melting pot model. They refer to themselves as a mosaic.
That's a good
So
one.
I think that goes also into the same direction as a quilt or a republic of nationalities. Do you have any other comments or questions around this sermon and the ideas of the Republic of Nationalities?
Isn't this how we look at ourselves today as Americans and as Jews?
Yes, thank you, Beatrice. So I actually do believe that what Magnes was advocating for eventually became a kind of a mainstream approach, but at his time it was still, revolutionary and something new. And I do believe that how we understand ourselves as Jews and Americans today resonates with what Magnes was envisioning more than 100 years ago.
Yes.
So thank you for mentioning that.
If I could just add a comment, I was thinking of mentioning the quilt analogy as well, but I don't know if anybody on the call is from New York City. I'm not from there, but I was born in upstate New York, and we lived in New York State after I grew up. But I've always been struck by one of the features of New York City in terms of the melting pot, that people, yes, they live in ethnic neighborhoods, but somehow they all magically become New Yorkers. Okay, and I think there's that overlay or maybe underlay of melting pot possibly in a place like New York City.
I mean, we're still so young as a country, and looking back at how young we were in 1900, there's all those little local cultures popping up, and with coexistence too.
Great. Thank you for that comment. I think that's a very good comment also to raise awareness to the differences between a melting pot on a national level and a local level, because maybe a concept like that functions on a local level, like in Manhattan or whatever in New York City, but not on a state level or national level. So I think that's also a very good point.
We just go back to your previous slide. You only had it up for a couple of seconds.
Of course.
No. Oh yeah, this one. I didn't have a chance to read the whole thing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course. So in this slide, I just wanted to provide additional information on growing anti-Semitic sentiments and hate crimes in the late 1800s and early 1900s, because that also helps us understand why Magnes and other Jews too, like Mordecai Kaplan, whom we studied a few weeks ago, or Bernard Ravel, whom we also studied a few weeks ago, came up with sermons or essays or articles against the melting pot model, because they said, this is not working. If you are discriminating against us, no matter how integrated we are, then the whole melting pot idea is not working. And these are some of the examples of how Jewish individuals, but also Jews as a collective were mistreated in various US states. Just as a historical context.
Saratoga incident, that was the start of the all the Jewish hotels in the Catskills.
Right. So that's in New York State. That's correct.
Yes.
Yes. So if that's okay with you, I wanted to move on to another
Yes.
aspect.
Thank you.
Another aspect of Magnes's life, and that's his community work. So many of you know or have heard of the American Jewish Committee, which is a relevant Jewish organization until today. It was founded in 1906, and Magnes was one of its co-founders. And the American Jewish Committee has been fighting or making awareness of anti-Semitism since its establishment. Today, they do a lot of Israel-related advocacy. At the time of its establishment, it was focusing exclusively on the United States and also the persecution of or persecuted Jews from Eastern Europe coming to the United States. But recently, it has also included Israel advocacy in their agenda. But anyway, Magnes was one of the co-founders or organizers of the first meetings of the American Jewish Committee. And what's, I think, also very exciting, that he organized an umbrella organization for all Jewish institutions in New York City. This organization was called the Kehillah, which is Hebrew and means literally community. And about 300 delegates represented a wide range of Jewish communities. Magnes managed to bring together Orthodox Jews, Reformed Jews, and anti-religious socialist Jews, Jews of German descent, Jews of Eastern European descent, established Jews from uptown Manhattan, and Jewish workers from other parts of the city, because he was really home in all these different communities. And there's a quote I found in a book by historian Jonathan Sarna. I just wanted to read it because I think he puts it's just a good summary of why Magnes managed to bring together all these people. So Sarna writes that thanks to the able leadership and chameleon-like qualities of Judah Magnes, who was at the same time trained in the classical Reform tradition, enchanted by orthodoxy, related to New York's best Jewish families through his marriage, and sympathetic both to Zionism and to socialism, an uneasy harmony prevailed. So one of the reasons why I'm personally so fascinated by Magnes is his ability to bring together all these different Jewish interest groups at one table. And the organization, the Kehillah, was like the public face of the Jewish community for over a decade in New York City on a local level. And it was absolutely something that Magnes achieved.
Was Magnes's wife an Orthodox Jew?
No, Magnes's wife came from a Reform Jewish household, a very rich Reform Jewish household, which also contributed to his success in raising funds and other aspects as well. So his wife came from the Marshall family. You might have heard of them. They were also involved in the American Jewish Committee. So it was an influential Jewish family of the time. And they might be still around. I don't know if they're still around, but in the early 1900s, they were a very influential family in New York.
But it was also German Jewish background families that helped bring all of the immigrants in from Ellis Island.
That's correct. That's correct. And yeah, that's absolutely correct.
So these were all Reformed Jews that were doing that?
Most of them were Reformed Jews. The majority of them were Reformed Jews. Again, I mean, there are always exceptions, but the majority of the German Jews were Reformed. And the majority of the Eastern European Jews were either Orthodox or labor Zionists or socialists or something like that. And there were many conflicts within these groups, but under Magnes's leadership, they managed to get together, which is very impressive. And I wish that we had leaders today like Judah Magnes, who manages to bring together Jews from all aspects of the community. That would be great.
Yes.
Now, so this all sounds great, but unfortunately, there were also conflicts within the Kehillah organization, and the Kehillah ended up dissolving in the early 20s. As you know, in the late 1910s, the First World War broke out, and Judah Magnes was a pacifist. So he rallied and spoke at rallies and demonstrations against the US entering the war. And this made many Jewish leaders abandon Magnes and abandon the Kehillah project. So eventually, the Kehillah lost its importance, and that was unfortunately the end for Magnes's career in the New York Jewish community, because he made a big step and left New York and left the US. So in 1922, after the nonprofit, the umbrella organization, the Kehillah, dissolved, Magnes decided to emigrate, and he moved to mandatory Palestine.
Oh.
And so he had an interesting take on Zionism and belonging to the land of Israel. He did not think that Jews need a nation state. So he emphasized that moving to the land of Israel doesn't mean that he thinks that Jews have to have a state in Palestine, but he believed that the land of Israel is a central part of Jewish identity, and that having Hebrew-speaking Jews living in Palestine and interacting with Jews living outside of Palestine, such as in the United States, is the solution for many problems that Jews in the diaspora face, such as assimilation. And Magnes believed that if these Jews in the diaspora continue to engage in dialogue with Jews in Palestine, that will strengthen the diaspora Jewish identity. And it is for this reason that he actually identified as a cultural Zionist. So he did not identify as a political Zionist. That means he did not advocate for the establishment of a Jewish political state, but he advocated for, well, not establishment, but creation of Jewish cultural presence in Palestine. And this is an idea that was first coined by a Ukrainian-born essayist, writer, philosopher called Aharat Ha'am, who, just like Magnes, imagined Palestine to be the center of Jewish intellectual, cultural life. There was a difference, though, a major difference between Magnes and Aharat Ha'am. Aharat Ha'am said that Palestine will be the center of Jewish intellectual and cultural life, and Magnes said it will be a center of Jewish intellectual and cultural life, meaning, in the opinion of Magnes, Palestine and the Hebrew speakers in Palestine should be equals to the Jews living in the US and to the Jews living in all parts of the globe. But both of them agreed that Jews have to have cultural presence in Palestine in order to preserve a strong Jewish identity around the globe. And I also wanted to mention that cultural Zionists were aware of Palestinian Arab presence in Palestine. And this might sound obvious to us today, but at the time, most Zionists really totally ignored the fact that there are people living there already. Like, if you read articles, books by political Zionist leaders or their speeches, David Ben-Gurion is, of course, a very important leader of political Zionists at the time. They completely ignore, they don't mention that there are people living there. And they don't mention that us moving to Palestine will lead to conflicts or might lead to conflicts. They totally ignore the topic. And cultural Zionists actually did raise awareness to that already in the late 1800s. that, okay, many of us will move to Palestine now, but there are already people living there, and what's going to happen? And what is at stake? So this is also something that both Achat Ha'am and Judah Magnes were aware of. So as I'm going to present now soon, Judah Magnes tried to reach an agreement with Palestinians living in mandatory Palestine, and he was engaged with work towards cultural pluralism, not only in the US, as we have seen already, but also in mandatory Palestine. So on the right side, you can see a picture of Henrietta Scholz, who was an American Jewish leader. She co-founded the Hadassah movement in Israel, and she also advocated for using the Hebrew language as a cultural, national cultural language of the Jews, both in the US and then later on in Palestine. Judah Magnes and Henrietta Scholz established together Jerusalem's first Reform conservative community, and called Chevra. So the name of their synagogue, or Chavurah today we would say, was Chevra, meaning society or community, whatever. And this was a community which advocated for a complete equality of the sexes, the brotherhood of Israel with all of humankind. And they were also looking for coexistence with non-Jewish inhabitants of Jerusalem. I wonder if you have heard of Henrietta Scholz before. I find her very impressive, but my impression is that she's not that well known. She should be more known.
And I just put in the chat that we're having a class on Henrietta Scholz on May 8th. So the link is in the chat.
Yes, thank you, Liz.
She started the Hadassah movement, and she's very well known in New York.
Right. A very interesting figure. And as we can see, Judah Magnes and Henrietta Scholz were also working together. And they were all part of the same American or Anglo expat, Jewish expat community in Jerusalem. Again, I have to say, even though the Chevra sounds like a great synagogue and a great project, they did not exist for too long. Both Scholz and Magnes ended up joining a modern Orthodox synagogue after a few months. But it was a first, and it was an initiative which is worth mentioning. Now, there is another aspect of Magnes's life in Palestine, which I wanted to mention, namely that he co-founded the Hebrew University. This person keeps fascinating me, and I already read everything about him, but he does so much. So he became the chancellor of Hebrew University in 1925. And together with Albert Einstein, who was one of the other co-founders, and Chaim Weizmann, who was a Zionist thinker and leader, politician, I would say. And I'm sorry. This was not an easy situation, because he had conflicts both with Einstein and with Weizmann. He had conflicts with Einstein over academics. Magnes he had a PhD, but he didn't have much academic work behind him. He has never had a university appointment or something like that. And Einstein questioned whether Magnes is the right person to be the chancellor of the university. And eventually Einstein left the whole Hebrew University project. I think he left a few years, less than 10 years after the establishment or the opening of the university. And Magnes had conflicts with Weizmann over Palestinians, and Weizmann was a political Zionist, so he did want to establish a Jewish state in Palestine, and he was not afraid to engage in violent conflict if there is no other solution. So that was definitely a line of conflict between Weizmann and Magnes. Nevertheless, the three of them were working together for some years, and Magnes remained the chancellor, and later on actually he was appointed president of the Hebrew University till the establishment of the State of Israel. because everything changed then, as we will soon find out. So now I wanted to bring in two sources by Judah Magnes about cultural pluralism and the challenges of cultural pluralism in Palestine. The first source is a letter that Judah Magnes wrote to Felix Warburg, who was a Zionist leader in Germany. And the second source I brought is an article by Judah Magnes that was published in the New York Times. Both of them are from 1929, and both of them express Magnes's dreams about Jews and non-Jews living together in peace in Palestine. He calls it Palestine all the time, which is also, of course, the term that most people were using at the time. So I wonder what your opinions are on these two sources, but first let us read them. Would anyone like to read this paragraph from the letter to Felix Warburg?
I'll read it.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yep.
Palestine does not belong to the Jews, and it does not belong to the Arabs, nor to Judaism or Christianity or Islam. It belongs to all of them together. It is the Holy Land. If the Arabs want an Arab national state in Palestine, it is as much or as little to be defended as if the Jews want a Jewish national state there. We must once and for all give up the idea of a Jewish Palestine in the sense that a Jewish Palestine is to exclude and do away with an Arab Palestine. Wow. The fact is that nothing there is possible unless Jews and Arabs work together in peace for the benefit of their common holy land. It must be our endeavor first to convince ourselves and then to convince others that Jews and Arabs, Muslims, Christians, and Jews have each as much right there, no more and no less than the other, equal rights and equal privileges and equal duties. That is very revolutionary.
Thank you, Beatrice. I agree, I agree.
Wow.
Would anyone like to share their thoughts about these few sentences?
Was that accepted by other Jewish leaders?
So not so much, unfortunately. Unfortunately, okay, I don't want to share my opinion, but anyway, at this time, he was already in minority. I would say that the same ideas 10 or 20 years before were still shared by some Jewish leaders, but by the 1920s, especially towards the late 1920s, there were many tensions in Palestine because as the number of Jews grew, also the number of tensions grew between Arabs, Palestinians, and Jews. And Magnes towards the late 1920s was definitely in a minority, especially a minority among Jews living in Palestine. He still had many supporters in the US who believed in, his ideas of social justice and equality, but on the ground in Palestine, at this point, he was definitely in a minority.
Yes. Oh boy.
I think I see, Leila, you are speaking, but you're on mute.
Mute. Okay. Who was Felix Warburg? I've heard the name, but I'm not sure. I know he's a prominent family. Was he a banker or what?
That's correct. So that's where the money comes from. He comes from a banking family, and they were Zionist leaders based in Germany. Yes.
Yeah.
This letter should be reprinted today. It's still relevant, I think.
Yes, no, I understand that it's very relevant. Well, which is the reason why I bring it to you, which is,
Thank you.
I think that many of the challenges that Magnes was facing are still around, and no one has found a solution. yet. So maybe we can find inspiration in these sources. I don't know, but that's, I think, definitely worth discussing. And so I also brought another source. Let's read it, and then maybe we can discuss the two sources together. So this is an article that Magnes published in the New York Times in the same year as the letter to Felix Warburg, and it expresses a very similar idea. Would anyone like to read it first?
I can.
Oh, thank you.
Says, the Jew must say to the Arab, we want no political domination by anyone. And the Arab must say to the Jew, we recognize the Jews' full right to be here. Jew and Arab should sit down together and then submit their joint proposals to the mandatory power. If a constitution and a legislative machinery can be worked out with this in view, it is everything that I personally should desire as far as the Jewish cultural and spiritual center was concerned. Palestine should not be a place of political domination at anyone's part, at all, on anyone's part. This making of Palestine the football of politics, Jewish, Arab, European, ought to be brought to an end. Unless Palestine can be built up on a high ethical basis, it is not worth anyone's having. Let the political issue be settled so that the work of real cooperation along economic, cultural, and social lines can begin in earnest.
Thank you, Rachel.
This was all before the immigration of all the people from World War II started flooding Israel with Jews.
That's correct. That's correct.
And they had no place else to go.
Yes.
But
so,
I find that if this had actually happened, I think that once that flood of folks came to Israel, I think it might have changed the way things worked, because the foundation would have been different, more egalitarian.
It's a good mission statement. Had we been able to, implant it in day one, unless it can be built on a high ethical basis, it's not worth anyone's having. Real
Do you
cooperation.
think the Jews would have emigrated to Israel if they knew that this was not to be a Jewish state?
I mean, it's hard to tell. I don't know. I don't know. I don't want to say anything because, but it's an idea we can consider, I think. But, or Beatrice, you want to share with us what you think? Is it a clear no? Is it a clear no? If it's a clear no, that's okay. Right.
No, it's okay. I feel that so many of the people that came, having nowhere else to go, and feeling that this was always taught in all of the religion, that this is their homeland, that this is where we are meant to be. Next year in Jerusalem, I can't believe that there could have been at any time people saying or really believing that this should be an international, like the Vatican, just a home for everybody. It would be beautiful, but it's very hard to accept.
Right. I understand that point, and I think the question is also, can we return to Jerusalem and share Jerusalem with others? And is that possible, or is it only a dream? In the case of Magnes, it remained a dream. I think that's for sure. But maybe in coming generations it will be reality. I don't know. All I'm saying is this is an idea that Judah Magnes promoted, and as I said, he was not very popular with his opinion at the time. But maybe we can find inspiration in his words, in our imagination of Jerusalem as a peaceful home for all. I don't know. I really have no agenda apart from learning with you. So.
Okay.
And I appreciate all your, raising concerns and sharing your opinions, because I understand this is not an easy topic, and no, definitely not.
But I'll thank you, Rabbi. Easy topics that we can all agree on aren't worth really talking about. These kinds of topics that are difficult are worth all of us touching on and sitting with.
Thank you, Rachel.
Learning how to talk about it. Yeah, it's not easy.
I will move on there. I think there are a few more slides about the aftermath of the partition plan and a shift in Zionist politics. So I have to say that for a few decades, there were actually numerous Jewish leaders who thought like Magnes and who shared his opinion of Palestine being a cultural, spiritual center that should be, and that the new society which will be established there should be of very high ethical values. So this was an idea which was also shared by others. But the growing tensions with Palestinians living in Palestine, which very often led to pogroms and death on all possible sides, and the rise of Nazism. I think this is an important point, which we will mention now, the rise of Nazism. And then when the first reports of the Holocaust appeared in 1942, the overwhelming majority of organized Jewry abandoned these idealistic notions and decided to go for the establishment of a Jewish national state in Palestine, no matter what happens. Then you can see an image of Ben Gurion on the top. He advocated this. He was a leader in this whole dialogue, and eventually he became, of course, also the leader of the newly established Jewish state in Israel. And this shift in organized Jewry made Magnes co-found a party. He liked to co-found things and organizations, apparently. So this shift in organized Jewish politics made Magnes co-found a party called Ichud, which in Hebrew means unity. And Ichud had a lot of intellectuals on the board, such as Martin Buber, the philosopher, and Henrietta Scholz, whom we have also heard about before. And Magnes, Scholz, Buber, and others together tried to achieve the creation of a bi-national Palestine composed of two equal nationalities, Jews and Arabs, with close cooperation with neighboring countries in the Middle East. So that was the agenda of Ichud. I have also brought you an image of Martin Buber on the left side and sitting next to Judah Magnes. This is an image that was taken at a meeting with the mandate authorities. Buber and Magnes, on behalf of Ichud, were trying to convince the mandate authorities not to let the partition happen, not to establish a separate Jewish state and a separate Palestinian state as the UN mandate partition, as the UN partition plan envisioned, but instead stick with Magnes's ideas and also Buber's ideas of a bi-national state, a state for Jews and Palestinians alike. I'm referring here to Elizabeth Thompson, who is a historian, and Thompson argues that one of the reasons why Magnes's and Buber's attempts failed was that the mandate politics did not understand cultural pluralism. Neither the British nor the Americans who were in charge of the area at this point could relate to the idea of a culturally pluralistic society. And even though they listened to Magnes and Buber and the other representatives of Ichud, they went with the more nationalistic political Zionist leaders such as David Ben-Gurion, because that was clear and that seemed doable, unlike the idealistic ideas of Magnes and Buber. So eventually, Ihud failed, and Ihud actually never became successful. I read that the most members they ever had was 70, and you can't establish a state with 70 people. So unfortunately, that was not a success. And Magnes eventually gave up his dreams about advocating for cultural pluralism in Palestine, and then at the eve of the 1948 war, independence war / Nakba, he returned to the US to lobby for a solution for the Palestinian refugee crisis. As you know, in 1948, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians left their homes as the Israeli army advanced in the territory. And later that year, Magnes passed away in New York from a heart attack. And I wanted to say a few words about his legacy. So when he passed away, the Union of Reform Jewish Congregations said in their statement that Magnes was one of the most distinguished rabbis of her age, the leader of the movement for goodwill between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, a man of prophetic stature by whose life and words the traditions of the rabbinate as well as the spiritual traditions of all mankind were enriched. And until today, the University Press of Hebrew University bears the name of Magnes. So you can see the logo in Hebrew, that's the logo of Magnes Press. And also the Jewish Library, the Jewish Studies Library and Art Collection of the University of Berkeley is named after Judah Magnes. That's the logo of the library on the right, since, as you remember, he was originally from San Francisco. And yeah, I find Magnes personally very inspiring, and my impression is that not too many know about his work and his ideas. And the goal of this presentation was to bring him and his philosophy a bit closer to Jews living in the 21st century. And I really hope that you could learn something new, and I hope that you will find inspiration in some of the activities and some of the writings of Judah Magnes. So thank you so much for listening, for being here, for sharing your thoughts and opinions. I appreciated it. Thank you.
Thank you.
You certainly gave me a lot to think about. Thank you.
That was my goal. Thank you. Thank you for saying that.
Yes. All right, well, I will stop the recording.